So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this 21st EURADOS webinar on computational support for retrospective dosimetry. My name is Liz Ainsbury. I have the pleasure of being the chair of Working Group 10 on retrospective dosimetry for EURADOS. I'm very happy this morning to introduce two of my colleagues who are going to talk about Monte Carlo modelling. Particularly, they're going to talk about analysis from an interlaboratory comparison and field test that we carried out in 2019 and how the work between Working Group 6 and Working Group 10 has helped to support what we're trying to do in terms of development of retrospective dosimetry methods. So Working Group 10 aims to develop and maintain the state of the art in retrospective dosimetry. So we're doing lots of very exciting research and trying to be ready for a large-scale radiation emergency response. And we're delighted this morning to be sharing with you some of the work that we've done towards this. We're going to go straight into the presentations and take questions at the end. So please put your questions in the Q&A on the right-hand side, and then we'll have a discussion session at the end. So without further ado, I would now like to introduce my colleague Hyung-Taek Kim from Carey. Delighted to have you here, Hyung-Taek. Thank you very much again for coming to present. And Hyung-Taek will talk about Monte Carlo reference dosimetry for the EURADOS Working Group 10 and RENEB field test. Apologies, I should have said this was a joint activity with RENEB as well. So over to you, Hyung-Taek. Thank you very much.
Thank you for kind introduction, Liz. My name is Hyung-Taek Kim from Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute. Today's my presentation is Monte Carlo reference dosimetry for 2019 EURADOS and RENEB field test. Before started, I have to say I'm really appreciate for taking this opportunity to read this collaboration. So thanks for all co-authors and participants, including EURADOS and RENEB network. Yeah, let's start from the brief introduction of retrospective dosimetry. In principle, every dosimetry is retrospective because dosimetry is done after an irradiation, but we are more focused on a set of techniques to estimate radiation dose received by individual from past dose exposures, such as radiological accident or terrors, where conventional dosimeter was absent or insufficient. With this regard, we have very nice toolbox to estimate those from victims or persons, such as clinical symptom, physical dosimetry, and biological dosimetry, and computational dosimetry, and internal dosimetry, plus other potential techniques all we have. And what is role of computational technique in retrospective dosimetry? Roughly, it can be divided by three. The first one is organ dose mapping. In a small-scale radiological accident, we had computational technique provided calculated organ doses as well as dose distribution on the body to give the guidance to the medical treatment or to estimate the potential risk. On the other hand, computational dosimetry can apply to dose assessment to the individual by calculating those coefficient from measurement of fortuitous dosimeters to human body. Detailed presentation will be given by the next speaker, John. And the third one is voting for ILCs. Retrospective dosimetry requires ILC because we want to verify the reliability and harmonization between techniques and between institute. So sometimes we had field experiment simulating realistic accident scenarios, such as Kato experiment in 2014. And in this kind of experiment, we had no reference irradiation. The irradiation is extremely heterogeneous. So in this case, Monte Carlo calculation can provide such as those bigger picture, such as dose mapping or specific reference doses, or even it can provide some other information such as energy spectra for the specific position. In 2019, we had very nice field experiment in Lund in Sweden. The purpose was evaluating retrospective dosimetry method as carried out in potential and real-life exposure scenarios, with considering a small-scale radiological accident with 4 different exposure geometries. Here, our computational techniques team had 2 strategies. The first one is supporting reference dosimetry and providing a computational ILC, which will be given by this presentation. And the second one is feasibility test of dose conversion methodology, which is the second presentation. Maybe you can find related publication to see the exposure geometries and other informations. And I will briefly introduce the field test. We used iridium source, highly active one, and in the phantom, we used 4 different phantoms I named as P1, P2, P3, P4. In case of P1 and P4, we used atom female phantom for P1 and male phantom for P4. And in case of P2 and P3 phantom, we used adult male random phantom. And we set the 2 exposures, setup 1 and setup 2. In case of setup 1, P1 is located at in the predominantly AP exposure with very close distance, around 28 centimeters from the source. And P2 was located partially shielded by P1. In case of P2, P3 was located predominantly AP exposure with power distance around more than 100 centimeters from the source. And in case of P4, it was located in predominantly LLLT situation. And we used lots of dosimeters in the experiment. For example, to estimate surface dose of the phantom, we applied RPLD and NaCl OSLD dosimeters front and back side of the phantom. And to see the organ doses, we inserted RPLD in P1 and RIF-TLD in P2. And unfortunately, there is not enough dosimeter for P3. And in case of P1, we used NaCl OSLD dosimeters inside of it. And to estimate the blood doses for the vacuum, to estimate the dose around vacuum flask, we used RPLD in and outside of the flask. And to estimate phone doses, we used OSLD, Luxel OSLD, and RIF-TLD and reference glasses. Additionally, we applied additional materials such as cigarette, chip card, and textile as a fortuitous materials. In this case, we also used RPLD to estimate reference doses. So, what is the object of the present study? First one is evaluating the reliability of calculation techniques by comparing to the reference measurement. The second one is verification of harmonization between computational techniques with considering different interpretations and approaches. The third one is providing additional information such as NS spectra and give other calculations such as the whole body doses. This is participant and their code. We have 5 participants from laboratory 1 to laboratory 5. Actually, laboratory 5 was recently participate this ILC test. 1 month ago, some guy contacted me. He expressed he want to participate this ILC test using Tripoli code. So I think it was quite cool. So I sent him the experimental portals and experimental setup, and he sent lots of doses. He calculated lots of doses, and I think I decided to include his data in this presentation. And anyway, so we have 3 code, JANT4 and MCMP and Tripoli. In case of laboratory 2, they use 2 different code, MCMP and JANT4. And for the phantom, human phantom, we used reference mesh or reference voxel depending on the institute. in case of mobile phone, only lab 1, 2, and 3 submitted the result. And in case of surface dosimeter, laboratory 1 and 5 submitted. And in case of vacuum flask, lab 1 and 3 submitted. And for organ doses, all the participants calculate organ doses. So what is major difference between modeling and between institute? The first one is experimental setup and photos were shared, but the slide arrangement can be different between participants. And in case of laboratory 2, 3, and 5, they use torso phantom by removing the legs or arms of boxer phantom to better copy the actual experimental setup. For laboratory 2 and 3, they used only one single dosimeter when 2 mobile phones were adjusted, whereas laboratory 1 considered all individual phone locations. And this is whole dosimeter placement. You can see the red cylinder indicating the vacuum flask, and the blue disc-shaped dosimeter represent the surface dosimeter, front side and back side, and gray rectangular slate represent the mobile phones, which include the reference glass and Luxel dosimeter and TLD inside of it. And because the measured data were all air chroma, we need to convert to the observed dose in metal. So we apply 2 factors. First one is energy-weighted mass energy absorption coefficient ratio, mu E, and the second one is relative air chroma response, SE. In case of mu E, we refer the NIST database. And in case of SE, we referred from the measurement data, published measurement data, as you can see in the plot. And in principle, SE compensate for the energy dependence in measurement, and MUE compensate the energy dependence between materials. So in total correction ratios will range from -7 to 8%, which is a relatively minor impact on doses. To estimate dose conversion, we calculate NS spectra depending on the position. For example, you can see the black dots representing the NS spectra on the front side of the phantom, and red dots representing the back side, the NS spectra on the back side of phantom. And then in case of P1 and P3, we definitely see the shift of energy spectra. And in case of P2, because P2 was located in highly heterogeneous situation, so we divide it more specifically, such as front right side, front left side, and front back right side and back left side. And for P4, there was no spectrum shift because it's located in LLAT situation. Before proceed, we consider several things to address quantitative comparison of many data. We calculate relative errors like these equations. In this equation, D calculation means calculated doses, and D reference indicates reference doses, and it can be measured doses when we compare to the calculate doses to the measured doses, and it can be averaged calculated doses when you compare the calculated doses among the participants. So we analyzed individual relative errors to check the stability of specific modeling approaches, but the details were too much to be presented in this presentation, so you can see the details in future publication. Instead, we analyzed statistical parameters to see the overall reliability of the techniques. That means ILC between calculation and measurement. In this case, we extracted the the parameters of linear fitting, such as slope and intercept, which indicate systemic under or overestimation, and adjusted R-square to see how well the linear model fits the data, and Pearson's R to estimate the strength of the linear relationship between measured and calculated doses. And after that, we can compare the calculated organ doses, because everyone has organ dose, every participant has organ doses, so we can confirm the harmonization between the participants. And the referred measurement data are listed below, and two are already published and one is in preparation. This result for P1, which is in homogeneous exposure in predominantly AP exposure. And on the right-hand side, you can see the exposure geometry. And on the left-hand side, you can see the measured dose to the calculated doses. I named each participant as G lab 1 or M lab 2 or T lab 5 to represent joint 4 result from lab 1 or MCMP result from lab 2. Yeah, something like that. And you can see the statistical parameters in the subset table. So in overall, we found good agreement between calculated and measured doses when we see the high Pearson's R values more than 0.95 or 0.85. And in case of G rep 1 and T rep 5, the red dashed line and green dashed line showed the most linear and highly correlated result. And MREP2 and MREP3, the blue and dark green color dashed line showed 20 to 30% of overestimation in the slope due to they used one dosimeter for to adjust mobile phones, especially for the phones close to the source. In case of GREP4 and MREP4, they showed only 20 to 30% of underestimation in the slope, and they exhibit lower R-square values because they only included organ doses that have higher deviation than other surface dosimeters. And when we compare the organ doses, I mean only the calculation data, we found most of the participants produced a very similar result within plus minus 10% of their average, except for the organs related to the limbs, such as skin and lymph node and muscles. And the lower doses of thyroid of G Rev 1 was due to the additional shielding by the custom designed mobile phone, because this mobile phone has batteries and several layers, giving some attenuations. And there was no significant difference between two types of phantoms in this case. In case of P2, which is partially shielded case, we experienced significant underestimation, around 0.35 to 0.71 in the slope. These were observed for most of the participants except T Rev 5, and for all the participants showed high deviations. As you can see, the very low adjusted R-square values around 0.6 or 0.5. This is due to the additional shielding of P1 arms, because it's partially shielded by P1. If we use intact phantom, we can experience additional shielding by P1. And it's possibly due to the inaccurate placement of P2 for all participants. In case of organ doses for the calculation, we found very high deviations between all participants. Presence of limbs introduced different organ doses as well as additional shielding, as I told you, from the P1. And for the intact phantom, such as GREV1 and GREV4 and MREV4, the average relative error will range from -17% to -1%. For the torso phantom, GREV3 and TREV5, average relative error will range from -2 to 40%. The result indicate, regardless the rim problem, presence of rims, most participants experienced the highest discrepancies in this partial shielding scenario. And for Phantom 3, which is homogeneous exposure in predominantly AP case, we have very nice, good agreement in GREV1 and TREV3. As you can see, the high Pearson's R and high adjust R-square values. On the other hand, we found poor statistical parameters for MREV3 because MREV3 doesn't include the lower dose positions, such as the doses on the backside. So it's not they don't have enough data to make a linear fit. And we found about 20% of overestimation in the slope of TREV3. And when we compare the organ doses of P3, excluding some organs such as skin, lymph node, muscles, and oral mucosa and prostate, the relative error is found to be within ±10% for all calculations. So we found very homogeneous result for this case. And all the high deviations are related to the existence of limbs. And Phantom 4, which is in inhomogeneous exposure in predominantly LLAT case, GREV1 and MREV3 and TREV5 showed high linear and highly correlated result when we compare the R-scale and Pearson's R values. And we found higher slope of MREV3, the blue dashed line, is due to they used one dosimeter to adjust mobile phone in highly heterogeneous exposures. And in case of GREV4 and MREV4, they were well fitted by linear function, but they exhibit lower adjusted R-scale values because of they have higher variation due to the organ doses. And in case of calculated organ doses, MREV3 exhibit higher deviations up to ±35% compared to the other participant. And in case of intact phantom, GREV1 and GREV4 and MREV4, they showed similar result within ±7% to each other. And in case of torso phantom, TREV5 of TREV5 is close to the intact phantom group. This does not mean MREV3 has wrong dose values. It just only represents the choice of the exposure geometries. So we thought the result implies the deviation. These deviations are attributed to the different arrangement of P4, majorly originated by the ambiguity of the central position of each phantom in case of LLAT scenario. And finally, we produced additional data, such as observed dose in teeth to provide reference doses for the EPL dosimetry. And we calculated body doses, such as whole body dose and effective dose. You can see the effective dose in the bracket. When you compare effective dose to the whole body dose, effective dose showed more homogeneous result, because effective dose is less impacted by the presence of limbs. And yeah, this is my conclusion. The Monte Carlo reference dosimetry was carried out in the EURADOS RANEV field test. When comparing the calculation with experimental data, we found good agreement in overall, with Pearson's R up to 0.9768 around that, And this demonstrates the reliability of computational technique for reference dosimetry in the ILC. However, significant outliers also confirmed in P2 and P4 case, showing an over and underestimation around plus minus 65% in the slope of linear fit, which are mainly due to the discrepancy in the exposure geometry. In case of computational ILC, difference between participant was less than plus minus 10% in case of P1 and P2 case, except for the organs relevant to the rims. We also find higher deviations, up to 40% in average relative error was occurred in P2 and P4 case scenarios due to the complexity of geometry and the presence of limbs added significant variations. Lastly, the Monte Carlo simulation provided additional and comprehensive data in the field test. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Young Tech. I'm sure everybody's clapping virtually. It's always a bit strange when you can't see or hear the audience, but fantastic summary. Thank you so much. As mentioned at the beginning, we're going to go straight over to the next presenter now. So I'm very happy to introduce John Eakins, a colleague of mine from the UK Health Security Agency. And John is going to talk about dose conversion in retrospective dosimetry, so this sort of other part of the exercise work. So straight over to you. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Please do shout unless you can't. So I'll start with the statement of the obvious, actually, but it's one that it doesn't necessarily get as much attention as perhaps it should do in dosimetry in general, and that's that dosimeters only ever record the doses that they receive, not the dose to the person who's wearing them. So there are a bunch of reasons why the dosimeter dose and the person dose could differ depending on exactly where the dosimeter is about the person and the field conditions, the exposure conditions the individual's getting. So they can actually change quite a bit or differ by quite a bit. Now, this is not really a big problem in occupational dosimetry and conventional dosimetry they're used to, because normally in occupational dosimetry, we have a fairly well-designed dosimeter with a good tissue equivalence and energy dependence response. It's normally appropriately worn, so an HP10 body dosimeter is worn on the torso, for example, in the right place, and it's responding in terms of a quantity that's designed specifically to protect that individual. So HP10 is a surrogate effective dose, for example. It can be a bigger problem, however, in emergency dosimetry. So as Tech has already alluded, in emergency dosimetry, we're interested in those occasions where people who are not occupationally exposed and not occupation monitored get exposed, so in emergency, in a terrorist incident or something like that. And in those circumstances, we look for fortuitous dosimeters. So in other words, surrogates that by good fortune happen to have dosimetric properties. These don't need to be precise. We're looking at nearest grey indicators of doses, and the idea is they're helping with the decision-making process. So we're making a statement that, look, result X may be associated with person Y, therefore take course of action Z. So Z could be go to hospital or go home or say goodbye to your loved ones or what have you. And there are various dosimeters, various fortuitous dosimeters that have been looked at. So we have dental enamel, we have salt, we have chip cards, we have mobile phones, we have bags, fabrics in bags. And none of these are well-designed dosimeters. None of those things were ever designed or ever intended to be used as a dosimeter. So they're not tissue equivalent and they don't have good energy and angle independent responses. They're also not appropriately worn. People put a mobile phone, for example, in a jacket pocket or a trouser pocket or a back pocket. So they're not where a dosimetrist would prefer them to be to measure the dose to the person. And they're responding in terms of absorbed dose or maybe a cesium equivalent air kerma, rather than some form of whole body dose quantity like effective dose or HP10, which will be used in occupational dosimetry. So all these problems that are not such an issue for conventional dosimetry can become an issue in fortuitous dosimetry. So one solution that's been posed to this is to use Monte Carlo modeling software. So the idea is that we will create models of the dosimeter and the body, so the individual, so that could be the voxel phantom or the mesh phantom. We can then place the dosimeters at different places about that virtual body, simulate different exposure conditions, and compare the dosimeter and the organ dose. So the idea then is that we might be able to derive some sort of conversion factor that relates the dosimeter dose to the concurrent estimate to the organs or the whole of the body, the aggregate body dose that the individual is receiving, that relates to that dose to the mobile phone, for example. So if we take something like the phone dosimetry, the idea is in our model is that we develop a realistic model of a mobile phone, a modern phone, so a touchscreen phone, using data provided by the manufacturers and X-ray chemical analyses and so on. We place it at relevant places about the body, so in a chest pocket or trouser pocket or what have you, and we simulate the exposure of that individual of that phone. And by looking at the ratio of the organ doses and the dosimeter doses, we're able to provide calibration factors. So if we define some calibration factor K here as the ratio between DO, so the organ dose, and DP, so the phone dose, we could then use that calibration factor during measurements. So if we take a measured phone dose, so DP here, M, we multiply it by our calibration factor, it gives the concurrent value of the true organ dose. And I put true very much here in inverted commas, because of course it's not necessarily the exact dose the individual will be getting, but it's a representation, it's a better representation of the dose that the person's getting than the mobile phone would be. So that's the idea. Of course, there are an infinite number of conditions that we could model, an infinite number of exposures that individuals could suffer. There are an infinite number of places that a mobile phone, or even a different type of mobile phone, could be placed about the body. So really up till now, and within working group 10 or working group or task group 10.8 specifically, in collaboration working group 6, our focus has been on two different approaches. So the first of those has been on generic model. So we've identified sets of standardized exposure conditions and modeled results to derive pre-calculated databases conversion factors. So this is similar to the approach that the ICRU and the ICRP follow for the standard conversion coefficients for HP10 or for effective dose that are published in ICRP 57 and ICRP 116. So these pre-calculated databases, conversion factors for a bunch of standardized exposure conditions. So that's the first branch. The other side is to look at bespoke models, so creating models on a very ad hoc basis, recreating exact exposure conditions, or as close as the exact exposure conditions as practicality allows. And this, of course, then is suitable for small-scale irradiation conditions. And these can be benchmarked against the measured data from interlaboratory comparisons, as Syntax mentioned. So these are the two approaches we've gone for so far. So we look at the generic models first of all, and there's been quite a lot of work on this, even though, as I say, of course, it's an infinite number of different exposure conditions that we could be interested in. So we've looked at resistors in mobile phones, so the aluminium oxide within mobile phones, which is known to have dosimetric properties. We've also looked at the phone glass, the silicon oxide glass, as well as the circuit board material within phones. So 3 different materials. We've looked at, originally we looked at 4 locations, so the chest. So we can imagine that's like a phone being positioned in the chest pocket. We look at the legs, so like a trouser pocket. The back, which is a phone imagined in a back trouser pocket, and the hip. So you can imagine someone holding someone's hand or in a shoulder bag by their side. We then also added a fifth one in use, so 30 centimeters in front of the individual. So imagine if somebody's using their phone during the exposure. So 5 different conditions. We looked at 7 exposure geometries. These are the exposure geometries that are standard within, again, standardly used within ICRP and ICRU, so AP, PAL, left and right lats, ISO, floor, so ground contamination scenario, and rotation isotropic. We also looked at some point sources as well. And we looked at 3 different radionuclides, so rhodium, cesium, and cobalt. These are expected to be fairly common in an emergency scenario. And we also looked at some low energy monohydric sources as well. So even though it doesn't actually sound perhaps there's too much there, if you were to do the permutation, you can actually see 3 different materials and 5 different locations and 7 exposure geometries. You can see the permutation, the number of different configurations of these that we could have with the different radionuclides actually becomes quite large quite quickly. And these are the sort of results we got. It's after a huge, big, boring table of data, which I won't go through, but you can see how for a given exposure, conditions at AP, PA, LAT, or what have you, we can model the doses to the organs, as well as an average to the whole body. So we can take the average of these and call that the whole body dose, because whole body dose for large doses is not defined, but you can imagine it's a little bit like effective dose, only without the and without the weighting factors, tissue weighting factors involved. And we can also look at other ways of measuring doses to individuals, but I'll mention that again later. So these are the kind of results we can get for the organs, and we can do similar things for the doses to the phones at these different locations. So chest, leg, back, AP, and so on for the different exposure scenarios. And from those, we can take the division between the two and come up with ratios of conversion coefficients. So the ratios here are simply the ratios of phone dose to the body doses that I showed on the previous slide, which provides our conversion factors. And we see there's quite a big range. In fact, we see that actually there's a big range of doses between the doses to the phones and the doses to the individual. So I point out one here for our lateral exposure. So this is for iridium. The black circle in the middle is the nominal dose to the person. And then the doses to either side or above and beyond it are the doses to above it. It's the chest, the leg and the back. So they're much, much higher. So they would over respond to this body dose. Whereas the dose for the phone when it's in the hip position, so by the side of the person, it's much, much lower than the dose. And so you can see the value of, or the idea of dose conversion, that it lumps these very disparate measured dose results from phones to a single body dose that the individual would get. Because of course we don't really care where the phone is located in their body, we just need to correct if the person is getting the same dose wherever their phone is, and we just want to be able to relate to that as best we can. So that's the idea, at least. Okay, so with all that data generated, and again, this is something we did within task group 10.8, we tabulated those conversion factors to provide our pre-calculated databases as results. So the idea is that with these spreadsheets, they could be used by individuals by laboratories analysing the data from phones in a real emergency, and essentially dialed up during those emergency to convert the doses measured by the phone. So we could put on the left here the phone IDs or whatever it is and enter the measured dose. And then we could select from these drop-down boxes the orientation and the location and the material that we're measuring, and output on the other side on the right the concurrent dose to the individual. And we can define that dose in different ways, different tissues like red bone marrow or body doses and so on. So that was the idea. So the idea then, just to summarize this, the idea is that the conversion factors relate the phone dose to the nominally true doses to the individual. So if we know that, for example, the leg dose from the conversion factor is roughly half that model body dose, we'd know that when we measure the phone dose in the laboratory for a phone in that position, with exposure conditions, we need to double it to come up with the dose to the individual. And of course, these values are specific to the radiation source, the geometry of the exposure, and the phone location. And so assuming that these conditions are known for a particular phone received by a laboratory in a real emergency situation, we can infer, we can reconstruct the dose to the owner of that phone that they must have received for the individual phone to receive that dose. And so you can see that it's essential to obtain this location information when collecting phones, when collecting the emergency dosimeters in the real emergency situation. And that leads to something of an elephant in the room. That leads to a problem that I haven't really addressed yet. And that is, in reality, we may not know where the phone was located during an exposure. And in fact, even if we think we do, there may be many other factors out there that make that accuracy, the accuracy of that information, dubious at best. So how close was the true location? Even if I know my phone is in my chest pocket, how close is that location, that true location, to that's assumed in the model of a chest, of the phone in the chest pocket? The procedure also assumes we know the geometry of the exposure. So what direction was the individual facing? We may not know. Did they move? Were they, I mean, presumably if there's a big bang, they might have been running away at the time. Where were they? And this is something of a fundamental problem in fortuitous dosimetry, that depending on the field, the dose reconstructed by the phone could be a serious under or overestimate of the dose received by the individual. So there could be, for example, as I showed earlier on that graph, for a right lateral exposure to iridium, the phone dose could overestimate the person dosed by factor 2, or could underestimate by a factor of 10, depending on where it is. But if we don't know where the phone and individual were, how confidently can we apply conversion factors? On the other hand, if we don't apply conversion factors, how usefully can we actually report the doses themselves? So this dichotomy of problem we have within fortuitous dosimetry. And this issue was examined in significant depth by ICRU report 94. They were looking at the issues surrounding body doses, conversion, and disposal geometry. And I won't summarize the whole report, but essentially the conclusion was that the uncertainties on the exposure conditions, so the ignorance of exactly where the phone was and where the individual was during the Big Bang event, is likely to be too large to render the dose conversion a practical option. Essentially recommended that for a large-scale accident, we simply use the absorbed dose to the dosimeter material, so that the aluminium oxide in the phone, for example, as the estimate of the individual dose, or as the quantity to base decisions on and inform opinions on during the emergency. They did notice more significant research and development is being required, so hence the point of this study that we're doing now. And did also note that in smaller accidents where we may have much better information, it is still appropriate perhaps to use a dose conversion process. So that's really where we are now. That's how we started this interlaboratory comparison exercise. So of course, on the one hand, using the modelling, using Monte Carlo modelling and dose conversion and dose comparison is useful for the reference dosimetry, so converting between the different types of doses measured by these different dosimeters. So of course, very much the focus of Hume-Tack's presentation earlier. But also, hopefully, by looking at this and by examining some of these issues, we can provide some insight into the uncertainties of the physical and computational approaches, and therefore perhaps test and quantify some of these assumptions that, or very reasonable assumptions that fed into the ICRU 94 report. So that was the idea of where we're going with this. So I won't talk too much about the intercomparison itself or the setup. Hume-Tack has already given a very good explanation of this. We have, just to recall, we have a bunch of four phantoms with a bunch of dosimeters and mobile phones and other materials distributed about their person. And we recreated the exposure conditions using MCMP and JANT for these dosimeters positioned on and inside the mesh phantom and the voxel phantom for these different exposure conditions. And so these are the questions: well, how can our modelling provide insight into some of these issues? You know, what uncertainties might we get from using bespoke conversion factors? So from the conversion factors particular to just this geometry. What if we use the generic conversion factors that we'd already calculated? What if we don't use conversion factors at all? And these uncertainties are likely to be both physical and human. And the human is quite key because different people are very likely to make different choices and take different approaches in their modelling or in their use of conversion factors. And so we can ask, well, do all the dosimeters perform as expected? Can we make different dosimeters on the same phantom essentially converge to the consistent result that we're saying, well, that's the dose that individual's getting? You know, and in principle, all dosimeters on the same individual should imply the same decision. You know, this person's got a high dose, this person's got no exposure at all. So do they? So that was the focus. Okay, so first of all, let's look at the generic conversion coefficients. This chronologically was the first thing we did, and we proposed just a very simple exercise. So back in 2019, just after the exposure, when the individual laboratories were taking apart their phones and analysing them to look at the doses that the resistors or the glass received, we also invited them to report the converted doses implied by those measurements. So we supplied them with this dose conversion spreadsheet, as well as some explanation of what the various parameters meant. So what chest was, what leg was, what hip was, and so on. And we also sent them the setup photographs, showed the rough locations and exposure conditions that were used. So the idea was that they used their judgment to choose the best options for the conversion factor. So the best of these drop-down options to go in the spreadsheet that most matched their conditions. And some of these, or very often, these are tantamount to choosing a least worst option. And this, even despite that least worth, this still likely represents the maximum possible information that's going to be in a real emergency. You know, in a real emergency, probably not are you going to have nice fancy photos showing where everything is. So even in this artificially, even this simple test experiment, it's an artificially high amount of information that people are getting. But okay, 9 labs provided results, so they're 2 phones each. We have 18 data points to look at. Some of those labs also provided quite useful comment on why they made a particular choice. So this is very useful when we're analysing the data subsequently. And the organiser, so in this case me, I also repeated the exercise to provide some sort of benchmark comparison of the choices that people made. So I tried to do it as blind as I could, so I just based on the same information what I thought these choices would be. And the results were somewhat stark. So we have on the left-hand column the phone identifier. So these are the 18 phones from, or the 9 times 2 phones, or 2 times 9 phones that were used by the different laboratories. On the left-hand side, the left-hand 3 columns, they were the choices that I made for these, for choosing which the geometry was of these exposures and where the phone was located. And then in the middle, we have the what the individual laboratories chose. And where I've highlighted in red is where there's disagreement. And the rather stark result is that in over 3/4 of cases, we disagreed. There was better agreement of location choice than geometry choice, but not always. So we see these four here, so L62 to L81. These are all of P3. So this is exposure here that was almost maybe the most AP-like of all the exposures. And we didn't agree in both of those, and didn't even agree in the case of where the phone was located. In one case, is I thought it was on the leg, and the individual thought it was by the hip. So even that there was this ambiguity in where this was. So huge disagreements, and it resulted in big differences. So by the different choices that the organizer that I made and the lab made, we would have chosen conversion factors that differed by up to a factor of 4, both too high and too low. And so the conclusion is really that two analysts using the same phone measurement with exactly the same information provided them could conclude two very, very different body dose estimates from exactly the same set of parameters and information they've been provided with. In fact, if we look at the standard deviation of all of these different ratios, so I have the ratio here of the conversion coefficient that I chose compared to the conversion coefficient that the individual laboratory chose, and we see this sort of huge range of different choices. And we look at the standard deviation, and it's a very sort of statistically dubious way of approaching this, but it's the only study we had. Very statistically dubious way of doing it. But we can say that from the statistic deviation, it's something like a 70% uncertainty, a 70% variation between the two, so a very, very large amount. It may not be quite as pessimistic as that, because some of these, it turned out when we started to look at the comments that people were making, and some of the mistakes that I made as well, but when I was analysing the data, some of it was actually quite obvious outliers. Some of it was quite obvious mistakes, silly mistakes that perhaps if there was a bit of training, perhaps if we had better checks, we had a second individual from the same lab giving a second pair of eyes to say, hang on, maybe you've got that wrong, maybe we should do something different. Maybe we could reduce it. If we got rid of those obvious outliers, that standard deviations could still be reduced to maybe sort of plus or minus 30%, but still very, very high. So, of course, I mean, this is a very artificial exposure. We wouldn't, of course, expect the body doses to be particularly accurate if we use generic data for the very highly bespoke conditions of the current ILC. But I think the large inconsistencies in these subjective choices were still quite surprising. Certainly, some of the choices that to me were completely obvious when I was making it were very different from what the individual was doing. And so this, the highlight here, the take home here is that the human factor in dose conversion is a very significant source of uncertainty if we use the generic data. Okay, so does a bespoke approach fare better? So we look at next the bespoke computational modeling. So this is taking the data from that was calculated by MCMP from the 4 labs for the mesh and the voxel phantoms that Hyun-Tak described in his presentation. So comparing the body dose and the phone doses, and hence deriving bespoke conversion factors for this particular geometry. We found generally good consistency between the body dose estimates. So from the 4 different labs, the estimates of the overall body dose. Body dose here, I'm defining as the average of all the organ doses, so as the average organ dose of the individual, and also slightly more focused average of the red bone marrow, stomach, GI tract, and brain doses, so very key organs that are key for ARS symptoms. So just 2 different ways of looking at body doses, because there is no preferred way of doing it anyway. So really just for the purposes of the exercise, just so we can have something to talk about, or something to analyze. And generally, as I said, we found fairly good consistency between those body dose estimates, but much larger or slightly larger differences in the model phone doses. So these could range from sort of 10 to 20%, depending on the exposure condition. So with the partial shielding or the AP-like or what have you. And the idea is because once again, or the explanation is because once again, the modeling is quite a subjective process. So different individuals make different choices and different approximations and different calls within their modeling. And so even within, again, this absolute perfect information that modelers have been provided with, we're still going to get an uncertainty on the bespoke conversion factors of 20% or so when we put these things together. So it's still relatively high. And we still found a very wide range of bespoke, because even though there are 20% uncertainty, actually some of the conversion factors themselves are quite large. We see some of these conversion factors are a factor of a few. So this K here, this third column, this is what we would multiply the the measured dose by, and it could be up to a factor of a few above or below. So this does at least demonstrate the need, or demonstrate the power, the potential usefulness for dose conversion, that we would actually be underestimating or overestimating the nominally true body dose by quite a bit if we didn't apply them. And we also found actually very large differences between the values of the bespoke factors and the generic data. So we have the ratio here. So the K is the bespoke conversion factor for specific situation, and the C is the conversion coefficient, the generic conversion coefficient that lab chose when they did the simple test exercise. And we see a factor of a few, or a range of a few difference between the two of them. So again, this demonstrates the limitations of applying generic data to a very specific bespoke interlaboratory comparison scenario. Okay, what about the measured data itself? Again, this is what we haven't really talked about so far. We've just talked about the dose conversion. And I'll go back to the beginning slightly for this and say, well, recall that the aim of fortuitous dosimetry is to help decision making. So again, I had this sort of slightly flippant: result X may be associated with person Y, therefore take course of action Z. So it's first ballpark dosimetry. Actually, a previous analysis, the multi-biodose project, proposed simply categorizing the results from phone dosimetry, for example, from emergency dosimetry. So results, doses from fortuitous dosimeters in a mass casualty scenario. So when we have tens, hundreds, thousands of people being exposed, instead of having accurate dosimetry to the nearest 15th decimal point, we're simply looking at the closest dose and then categorizing it. So we're saying if the person is getting less than a grade, they're unlikely to develop symptoms. If they're associated with more than 2 gray, moderate to urgent care may be required, and between 1 and 2 gray, it's this slightly in between area where they may experience symptoms and follow-up care may be necessary. Okay, so that's the history. So the question, well, how do the converted and the unconverted data from the interlaboratory comparison, how do those measurements fare within these frameworks? Actually, if we did nothing at that point, they would all be in the below 1 gray low, because the exposure conditions were such that they all receive less than a gray anyway. It wouldn't actually be very useful or very interesting to immediately apply the multi-biodose criteria. So instead of applied an arbitrary scaling factor, so multiplied all the results, all the measurements for the phone doses and the individuals by 5.5, and that was chosen again somewhat arbitrarily, but it was chosen because it means that P2, phantom P2, receives a low dose, so 0.3 gray, P3 an intermediate dose, so in this amber category, P4 is only just in the red category, and P1 is well within the high dose category, so it would have received 3 gray or so. So it's arbitrary, but it's hopefully useful. And I was then able to categorize the doses within these categories. So we have here again the 18 different phones, and in the third column it's the nominal body dose that phantom received. So phantom P4 received 2.2 gray and so on. And then from the resistors, we have in the first column the measured data. So this is the raw unconverted data. The generic then, so it's that measured data multiplied by the generic conversion coefficient, and then it's the bespoke and the measured data multiplied by bespoke conversion coefficients. And where we've color coded it, we see, well, green means that result has been in the correct category, so matches the same as the body dose. Light blue is 1 category over, dark blue is 2 categories over, and then 1 category under and 2 categories under for the red. And we see that in most of these cases we get correct dose categorization. So there's no obvious trend when we compare the raw measured data versus generic converted data versus bespoke converted data sets. So most of these here are green, that they've been correctly categorized. But many high doses have been greatly overestimated, especially in the unconverted data set. And we can show that by changing our arbitrary scaling factor by reducing it by 50%, so 2.75. It's still very arbitrary, of course, but it shows a different pattern now. Now we see that miscategorizations are much, much more frequent and the trends more obvious. So we see that now, in most of the cases, the measured data greatly overestimate. The generic data are miscategorized not as much as the measured data, but nowhere near as well as the bespoke data, where, again, we're getting a much better dose categorization. So in this case, it's shown that doing a bespoke conversion factor provides much better dosimetry. But I put a barb in that, I open a question that is, well, how much do we or should we care about these overestimates? And I'll come back to this in a little bit long. We can also look at the body dose, so that the mean body dose that the phantom is getting. So this is now the unscaled data again. I've gone back to the raw data. We can look at the body dose, the mean phone dose for all the phones on that individual, the mean response. So the response is defined as the unconverted or the converted measured dose, depending on what we're trying to look at the time, divided by the true body dose. So the response of that dosimeter, and also then the coefficient of variance of those individual phones about the mean. And we see that the dose estimate and therefore the mean response is improved by applying generic conversion coefficients. As we go from the measured row, so we look at the top row, measured to go to generic, our response gets better, and it's improved even more by going to bespoke conversion factors. And this is true for both resistors and glass. So using conversion factors always gives mean doses that are closer to the nominally true values than the unconverted results do, and using bespoke conversion factors gives the best ones of all, which is probably what we would expect. We can also look at coefficients of variance. So ideally, all dosimeters around the same person would lead to a consistent estimate of their dose. That would be the perfect from retrospective dosimetry. But actually, we get a wide range of results found. So we see quite high coefficients of variance. So we can possibly suggest reinterpreting these coefficients of variance as kind of a minimum uncertainty that might be applicable for a multiple assay in assessing doses of these 4 individuals. And these range from 20% when we use for glass of the bespoke, up to 80% for the unconverted, the measured data. Now, that large range, that 80%, is obviously pretty unsurprising in the unconverted data, because different locations of phones typically lead to very different exposure conditions. It's exactly what we expect, and it's exactly why we perform the dose conversion. And so it's perhaps a little surprising that we still see distributions even in the converted data, which should partially mitigate that effect. Their coefficients of variance are lower, but we still see these distributions even when we're normally corrected for those locational effects. So, why do we get this? And I say, well, actually, this widespread in the converted data does not necessarily imply that the approach is itself flawed, because there are large systematic and other uncertainties on the measured data that must be going on. So we look at phone L81. So the resistors and the glass in that, of course, getting a pretty much identical exposure in exactly the same place, but the resistors greatly overestimate the true dose. The glass greatly underestimates it. So there must be something going, hidden uncertainties and measurements going on there. And dose conversion won't help here, of course. It's not going to solve that problem that we're getting this wide range of results. I could ask, well, would dose averaging be a better approach? So we see that, both phones L31 and L92, they're both on phantom P1. As you can see, they're both on the same phantom. But the resistors in L31 are roughly twice the body dose of P1, whereas L92, they're roughly half the body dose for P1. So if an individual had 2 phones, so the same individual, one's in a chest pocket and one's in a trouser pocket, if they both have 2 phones, if we average those 2 phone results, we'd get a good estimate of exposure. So that's a good thing. But in reality, individuals are unlikely to carry more than 1 phone. If we reinterpret that scenario as 2 individuals, both receiving an identical exposure, but having their phone in different places, well, then neither would receive a reliable estimate of their dose. One would be saying the dose is much higher than it is. The other will be saying it's much lower than it actually is. So one will be saying it's a safe exposure, they can go home. The other one will be saying, no, it's an emergency, they need to go to hospital now. You can say, would dose averaging be a better approach? So again, we look at just one phone, L31, and we look at just the resistor and the glass dose from them. And we see the resistor is roughly twice the body dose, the glass is roughly equal to body dose. So if we would average those 2, that'd be better than just taking the resistor result, but it'd also be much worse than just taking the glass result. And again, dose conversion won't help here. It won't help our results. It won't give us a better answer. And actually, we can extrapolate that. We can say, we can ask, is it always better to decrease the number of component estimates? And we can actually see that the dose from all of the resistors and glass, the response from all of the glass of given phone for all the phones about P1, for example, is actually worse than the response from just taking the resistors. So again, it's sort of saying that even when a multiple phone multi-assay approach is an option, increasing the size of that data pool does not necessarily improve the quality of inferences that are drawn from it. And again, dose conversion won't solve this. So I just put up my final summary now, so I'm running out of time anyway. So, okay, the statement of ignorance of the exposure conditions will interact results when conversion coefficients applied. And actually, even when we have nominally complete information, the choice of the phone, position, exposure is still subjective. And we might put something like a 70% uncertainty finger in the air estimate of the component, the subjective component of dose conversion when we use generic conversion coefficients. Possibly you could reduce this. And I should say also it's highly heuristic and based on one very small, rather unscientific study, but it's still, it's still much higher than perhaps we might have imagined. In almost all cases, applying generic conversion coefficients led to doses being overestimated, so that using generic gave in most cases a 2 times an average overestimate, but that compares to 3 times if no conversion coefficients are being applied. Although on the other hand, in some cases, using the wrong or no conversion coefficient led to serious underestimates. Using the bespoke coefficient gave best estimates overall. Of course, we'd expect that, and we might expect something like a 20% uncertainty on those bespoke conversion coefficients. But in reality, this is a minimum. Again, in reality, the available information is likely to be incomplete, leading to much higher uncertainties than might be implied by this 20% or so. So even this artificial case, it's going to be much higher than that in reality. Okay, clearly all these findings, it's a very, very simple scoping study. It's very limited data set. So they all should be viewed with some sort of skepticism, but they do show a clear need for dose conversion. That said, the points highlighted in ICIU 94 are hard to argue against. In reality, we're not going to know necessarily very well where the phone was, and there's always going to be very large subjective and objective uncertainties, even when nominally competent information is known. On the other hand, again, the phone dose is always wrong by definition. So there's this dichotomy that we find ourselves in. And actually, the advantages of dose conversion are slightly less clear-cut when applied to real measured data that we might get, because we found in some cases conversion still led to better dose estimates, but some of those benefits were eroded by the large systematic uncertainties that we found on the measurements. So we still have a problem that dose conversion is not going to be able to solve. Okay, ideally all dosimeters around a person would report the same dose, but large variations were seen, and again inconsistency uncertainties in the root measurements were the likely cause of that. I should say actually may not be quite as pessimistic as that, because in this particular interlaboratory comparison, the exposures were close. The doses that the phones were getting were close to their detection limits. So instead of extrapolating, we should really repeat this at high doses to get a much better picture. So it may not be quite as damning as I seem to be implying here. But finally, how much does this matter? If all we want from retrospective dosimetry, vendors dosimetry, is essentially a dose or no dose flagging for the purposes of initial phase dosimetry, then it doesn't matter if we overestimate. But on the other hand, we say, well, how many false positives are tolerable? How many false positives can we stomach? How many people do we send to hospital saying this person's got a dose when really they haven't? Now, we may say it's better to err on the side of caution, but if in a big scale event, many people are going to hospital, then those resources are going to quickly get overwhelmed. If we do say, well, actually, we want more than flagging, dose or no dose flagging, we might have to ask the question of what level of uncertainty is acceptable for initial phase dosimetry, and how could we possibly check or quantify that in a real emergency? And I asked this sort of philosophical question, which I'm not going to answer, but I asked a philosophical question of when, if ever, does bad data become worse than no data at all? Because we never get a false negative from doing nothing. If we do nothing, we're never going to send somebody home saying they didn't get a dose when really they needed to go to hospital. These are all important issues left as questions for the future, and I'm not going to answer any of them here. I'm just going to leave them hanging for others to consider. Instead, I'll just thank my colleagues within the working group, those that contributed, my co-authors of this paper who contributed to it, and also to everybody who contributed their anonymized data for the simple dose conversion exercise. And with that, I'll
Thank you so much, John. Absolutely fantastic. Again, virtual round of applause all round. Really, really great summary of some very detailed pieces of work, but overall, in great support of sort of development of retrospective dosimetry, how we can actually use these techniques in real life. I think we have one or two questions. So we have run over slightly. My apologies for that, but we'll just carry on for another couple of minutes if John and Young Tech have time. There's a question here from David Spencer. who says the medical services would use the dosimetry information in addition to how the patient is presenting. That's absolutely correct. Medics treat clinical signs and symptoms, but dose information can certainly be helpful. I don't know, John, if you want to, or Hyung Taek, you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, of course, I agree with that as a statement. You know, I think the idea of retrospective dosimetry in general is it's a toolkit, and it's one more data point that can be used. You know, clearly, if someone's demonstrating all the symptoms of ARS, then you know whatever the phone says, they're going to be looked at. I think it's more about perhaps looking at those grey areas where the person isn't necessarily presenting anything. That's the real power of retrospective dosimetry, and where they can just give a little bit of extra information that hopefully would help that individual in the clinical situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And indeed, how we envisage using retrospective dosimetry in real life is as a kind of secondary rapid response tool. So anybody who clearly has clinical signs and symptoms will go to hospital, and then those individuals who may have had between sort of 1 or 2 and 3 or 4 grey may not immediately have any signs and symptoms. We need to identify those from the worried well. So yeah, that's great stuff. And then I think one of the kind of key questions for me, and you sort of both covered it a little bit, but in a large scale accident scenario, obviously when you've only got 1 or 2 individuals, there are labs around the world with capacity to do some detailed modelling, really think about the organ doses and the potential consequences of those for 1 or 2 individuals. But in a very large scale scenario, which we prepare for, but of course we hope never happens again, there could be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of individuals potentially exposed. And then do you envisage, John and Hyung Taek, this eventually really helping in that kind of scenario? Because obviously there's quite a lot of work around, it takes time to apply these methods and think about how to apply them properly. So, you know, how do you see that working as we develop further?
I think it's a difficult question to say how we predict in the future. Of course, I mean, I think we'd all like to think it'd be a useful thing, because you know, I put the slightly bleak question at the end of, you know, when does no data become better than, you know, bad data become better than no data? But generally, I think it's fair to say that the more information we have, the more useful it is going to be. I think the value of this sort of in comparison is that it shows the uncertainties, and it shows what we can't do just as much as what we can do. I think it's been shown that, for example, phones and glass, they can be used, they can act as dosimeters in a laboratory situation. How that's then taken out of that into the field is useful. And even if perhaps the future is not phones or glasses or anything else, when technology changes, I mean, who knows what's going to be around in 5 years' time? You know, we may have chips implanted in our heads or something that we use instead of mobile phones. You know, who knows? But you know, as I think the techniques and the ideas of dose conversion and of looking at dosage individuals are always going to be valuable, and I think that there'll still be some useful work there when we start to look at some of these uncertainties, because whatever we use as an emergency dosimeter will face some of these issues that whatever it is unlikely to be designed to be an emergency dosimeter. So there'll always be these issues of dose conversion and accuracy and tissue and equivalence and so on. So I think it's important as we continue horizon scanning as new things come along and the new challenges that they may present, as well as where they're just repeating some of the problems that we currently have.
Yeah, definitely.
In my opinion, I think if we had that kind of situation, it highly depends on the information available, such as in these days we have many CCTV cameras and mobile phone cameras, so we can monitor the exposure. If we can access the detailed information, then in that case, principally, technically, maybe we can use some calculation, very fast calculation, by using GPU boosting techniques for the Monte Carlo simulation. So I think it's highly dependent on the information we can use.
Strongly agreed. Well, I think, you know, it's absolutely clear a lot of work is ongoing in this area, a lot further work needed, but this sort of leads nicely into what we're trying to do. As I said at the start, we attempt to maintain and indeed further develop the state of the art in retrospective dosimetry as one of the tools, the dosimetry tools in support of a radiation emergency. So with that, I think I'll bring the session to a close. Thank you so much again, Hyung Taek and John. Brilliant presentations, really great to see those. Looking forward to the publications as well. Please do, I put our email addresses, I hope you don't mind, in the chat. So please do get in touch if you're interested in joining Working Group 10. You can see we do lots of really interesting things, so do send me an email. Just before we go, I also put in the chat a little bit earlier, the 22nd EURADOS webinar is already announced. That will take place on the 20th of October at 3 p.m. Central European time. Do have a look at the EURADOS website to register for that. Otherwise, thank you very much again for listening. Apologies for going over time, and have a lovely day, everybody. We will see you again soon. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay. See you.